There are moments in life when the truth does not arrive gently, it does not knock. It forces its way into the room, breathless and uninvited, carrying with it a weight so heavy that the soul instinctively recoils. You sit there, listening, while words spill out of another person's mouth, confessions they never planned to make, admissions they once buried under excuses, silence, or carefully crafted lies. And as they speak, something inside you tightens, not with shock alone, but with a quiet, nauseating clarity. This is what they did. This is who they chose to be. And there is no dressing it up, no softening the edges, no calling it a misunderstanding. It is, quite simply, disturbing. What makes such confessions unbearable is not merely the act itself, but the cold awareness with which it was carried out. These were not accidents stumbled into blindly. These were decisions weighed, measured, and then committed. They knew the cost, they knew the harm, they knew what it would do to you. And yet, somewhere along the way, your pain became an acceptable price. When they finally speak, when the truth tumbles out in fragments or full sentences, it leaves behind a silence thicker than any lie they ever told. You realize that what disgusts you most is not the ugliness of the act, but the ease with which it lived inside them. There is a peculiar cruelty in hearing someone calmly describe the very thing that shattered you. They speak as if recounting a distant story, detached from the devastation it caused. They may even expect relief, forgiveness, or understanding, as though honesty alone can cleanse the stain. But truth, when it arrives too late, does not always heal. Sometimes it wounds afresh. Sometimes it forces you to see that the person before you is not merely flawed, but frighteningly capable of choosing darkness while looking you straight in the eye. And yet there is something sobering, even soberingly useful in such a confession. For illusion dies the moment truth is spoken. The image you protected, the excuses you made on their behalf, the hope that maybe it was not as bad as it felt, all of it collapses. You are no longer dealing with suspicion or intuition. You are dealing with fact. And facts, however revolting, have a strange power. They free you from self-doubt. You no longer need to ask whether you were too sensitive, too harsh, or too quick to judge. The truth answers for you. What follows is not peace, at least not immediately. It is a reckoning. You must now accept that the person who harmed you did so knowingly, perhaps even repeatedly. This realization can shake one's faith in human goodness, making the world seem a colder, more treacherous place. But it also sharpens discernment. You begin to understand that evil does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers politely, smiles convincingly, and waits for trust to settle in before it strikes. There is also a strange humility forced upon the one who hears such a confession. You recognize that you are capable of being deceived, that love or loyalty can blind even the cautious. This is not a reason for shame. It is a reminder of your humanity. The disgust you feel is not weakness, it is moral clarity asserting itself. It is your inner compass recoiling at something fundamentally wrong. Do not rush to make meaning of their confession for their sake. The truth was not spoken to ease your burden. It was spoken because it could no longer remain hidden. Your responsibility now is not to absolve them, but to protect what remains of your soul. Distance, silence, and firm boundaries are not acts of cruelty. They are acts of wisdom. When someone shows you the depth of their disregard, believing them is not bitterness. It is sanity. In time, the revulsion fades into something steadier. Resolve. You carry the knowledge forward, not as a weapon, but as a shield. You learn that integrity is revealed not by what people promise, but by what they confess when they think the worst is already over. And perhaps the most unsettling truth of all is this: While their actions may disgust you, your refusal to ignore them is the first step toward reclaiming your dignity. There are truths that arrive gently, like light through a window at dawn, and then there are truths that arrive like a door being kicked in while you are still asleep. This kind of truth does not wait for readiness. It does not consider timing, emotional strength, or the fragile balance you were barely maintaining. It crashes into awareness, loud and unavoidable, leaving no space to prepare your heart. One moment you are living inside uncertainty, suspicion, or quiet discomfort, and the next, reality stands naked before you, demanding to be seen. The violence of such truth is not physical, yet it shakes the inner world just as fiercely. What makes this arrival so brutal is the suddenness with which innocence is stripped away. You are not eased into understanding, you are thrust into it. The mind scrambles to catch up, replaying memories, reinterpreting moments that once seemed harmless. Every conversation becomes evidence. Every silence now carries meaning. It feels as though the ground beneath your feet has shifted without warning, and you are forced to stand upright on a landscape you do not recognize. There is no gradual adjustment, only impact. The soul reacts instinctively to this kind of truth. It recoils, it tightens, it resists, not because the truth is unclear, but because it is too clear. Clarity, when it comes too fast, is frightening. It removes the protective fog that once softened reality. You can no longer hide behind maybe, perhaps, or I'm overthinking. The truth announces itself with certainty, and certainty leaves no room to escape. It is not the knowing that hurts first. It is the way knowing arrives without mercy. There is also a sense of betrayal embedded in the timing. You begin to ask why this truth waited until now. Why did it not reveal itself sooner when you might have been spared deeper damage? Why did it allow you to invest more trust, more patience, more pieces of yourself? The violence of truth is amplified by the realization that while you were trying to be kind, understanding, or loyal, reality was quietly forming behind your back. This realization can feel humiliating, even when you did nothing wrong. Such truth also isolates. When it hits, you often find yourself alone with it, unable to immediately explain the weight to others. Words feel insufficient. How do you describe the moment when your internal world fractures in silence? How do you explain that nothing outward changed, yet everything inward collapsed? The violence is internal, invisible, and therefore misunderstood. Others may see composure, but inside there is chaos, 1,000 thoughts colliding, demanding answers that may never come. There is a peculiar exhaustion that follows. Not the tiredness of the body, but the fatigue of sudden awareness. The mind works relentlessly, replaying the moment of revelation again and again, as if repetition might soften its blow. Sleep becomes shallow. Silence becomes loud. Even moments of calm feel suspicious, as though peace itself can no longer be trusted. Truth, when it arrives this way, does not simply inform, it occupies. And yet, hidden within this violent arrival is an irreversible shift. Once the truth is known, it cannot be unknown. The door it breaks open never fully closes again. Though the initial impact is devastating, something quietly begins to rearrange itself. The illusions that once drained your energy no longer demand maintenance. The lies that required constant emotional labor collapse under their own weight. Painful clarity, though brutal, removes the exhausting task of pretending. This kind of truth marks a before and an after. Before, there was confusion dressed as hope. After, there is pain sharpened by understanding. It is not a clean transformation, nor a comforting one, but it is real. And reality, even when it arrives violently, has a strange way of anchoring the soul. You may feel shattered in the moment of impact, but fragments of honesty settle where false peace once lived. The truth did not ask permission to enter, but once inside, it refuses to lie to you ever again. Confessions are often more disturbing than lies because they confirm something the heart desperately hoped was not true, that the harm was not accidental, not careless, not born of confusion, but chosen. A lie allows space for doubt. It leaves room for explanations, for misunderstandings, for the fragile hope that maybe things only appeared cruel, but a confession slams that door shut. It replaces uncertainty with certainty, and certainty, when it reveals intentional harm, is far more unsettling than deception ever was. A lie suggests fear, weakness, or avoidance. A confession, especially a delayed one, exposes calculation. It reveals that someone knew exactly what they were doing while doing it. They weighed options, they recognized consequences, they understood the potential damage, and proceeded anyway. This is what makes the truth so difficult to swallow. You are no longer wrestling with what might have happened. You are facing what was decided. The discomfort comes not only from the act itself, but from realizing it was carried out with awareness. When someone lies, the mind can protect itself by imagining innocence behind ignorance. Perhaps they didn't realize how much it would hurt. Perhaps they acted impulsively. Perhaps they were confused. A confession strips away these defenses. It tells you, plainly and without disguise, that your pain was foreseeable and still ignored. That realization pierces deeper than betrayal alone. It attacks the very foundation of trust you once built. There is also something chilling about the composure with which confessions are often delivered. The speaker may appear calm, reflective, even relieved. Meanwhile, the listener feels their inner world fracture. This imbalance creates a quiet horror. You begin to sense that the person recounting the truth has already processed it, already justified it, already moved past the moment that is only now destroying you. The confession becomes less an act of accountability and more a revelation of emotional distance. Confessions can also feel grotesque because they expose a moral gap you did not want to see. You discover that your values were never shared as deeply as you believed. While you operated under loyalty, empathy, or conscience, the other person functioned under self-interest or convenience. The lie allowed you to assume shared principles. The confession reveals that you were standing on opposite sides of an ethical divide, unknowingly trying to meet in the middle. What unsettles the soul most is not just what they admit, but what they omit. Often, a confession contains only what can no longer be hidden, not the full scope of truth. This leaves you wondering how much remains unsaid. If they chose to reveal this, what else did they decide to keep buried? The confession, rather than bringing closure, opens a new layer of uncertainty, one that feels darker because it is now anchored in proof. There is also a painful shift in self-perception. You may find yourself asking why you did not see it sooner, why you trusted so deeply, why you defended them when doubt whispered. This self-questioning is cruel but common, yet the confession itself answers those questions. You trusted because you were honest. You believed because you were sincere. The flaw was not in your character, but in assuming theirs mirrored your own. In the end, confessions disturb more than lies because they force moral clarity. They remove all ambiguity and place responsibility exactly where it belongs. There is no longer a need to interpret behavior or decode silence. The truth stands exposed, and with it, the uncomfortable realization that some people are capable of knowingly doing harm while appearing harmless. This knowledge changes you, not by hardening your heart, but by sharpening your discernment. The lie insulted your intelligence. The confession challenges your understanding of human nature itself. What disgusts you most is not merely the act itself, but the calm awareness with which it lived inside them. It is the realization that this was not chaos, not a moment of losing control, not a blur of emotion that carried them somewhere unintended. It was clarity, it was presence of mind. They were there while doing it. They understood what it meant, they recognized its weight, and still they proceeded. That awareness changes everything because it removes the comfort of accident and replaces it with intention. There is something deeply unsettling about knowing a person could stand in the full light of understanding and still choose what they chose. You imagine them pausing even briefly, sensing the line they were about to cross, and stepping over it anyway. That image lingers, it stains memory, it forces you to confront a truth far more disturbing than the harm itself, that someone can know better and still decide worse. This is not ignorance, it is consent to wrongdoing. The mind struggles to reconcile this. You want to believe that people hurt others because they are confused, broken, or unaware. Those explanations are easier to carry. They allow compassion to survive. But awareness dismantles that mercy. When someone acts with full knowledge, the act becomes a statement of values. It says, without words, that something else mattered more than your safety, dignity, or trust. And that is where disgust takes root, not in anger, but in moral revulsion. You begin to notice how calculated everything now appears in retrospect. Words that once seemed spontaneous feel rehearsed. Silences feel deliberate. Choices that were explained away as coincidence begin to reveal pattern. Awareness leaves fingerprints everywhere. The past rearranges itself under this new light, and suddenly what you thought was care looks like convenience, and what you thought was love looks conditional. This reevaluation is exhausting but unavoidable once awareness is confirmed. What deepens the disgust is the realization that awareness often coexists with charm. They did not appear monstrous while acting monstrously. They laughed, smiled, spoke kindly, perhaps even reassured you, while carrying knowledge that would have shattered you if revealed sooner. This duality is hard to stomach. It suggests a capacity to compartmentalize harm, to separate action from conscience, and when you see that clearly, innocence dies in a way that cannot be revived. There is also an unspoken insult embedded in such awareness. It implies they believed you would endure it, forgive it, or never uncover it. Awareness without restraint assumes tolerance. It assumes your pain is manageable, your voice containable, your truth postponable. This assumption wounds pride as much as trust. It reveals not only what they did, but how they measured you and found you safe to harm. Disgust, then, becomes a form of clarity. It is the soul's refusal to normalize what should never have been acceptable. It is the inner recoil against a moral breach too wide to ignore. This feeling is not pettiness or resentment, it is recognition. Recognition that some actions, when performed knowingly, sever something essential. They cross a line from mistake into revelation. And once you recognize this, something irreversible happens within you. You stop searching for explanations that soften the truth. You stop trying to humanize what was already fully human and chose wrong. Awareness strips the act of all excuses, leaving only responsibility behind. That is why the disgust feels so final. It is not loud, but it is firm. It does not shout. It settles. In that settling, you begin to understand that the awareness they carried while harming you is the very thing that now frees you from obligation to excuse them. You are no longer required to reinterpret, rationalize, or redeem the act in your mind. The disgust draws a boundary where confusion once lived, and within that boundary something steadier forms, not hatred, but certainty. Certainty that knowing harm and choosing it is not something you are meant to carry on your conscience, no matter how calmly they once carried it on theirs. Hearing someone describe your pain without emotion reveals something far more disturbing than the harm itself, a frightening absence of conscience. It is not only what they say, but how they say it. Their voice remains steady, their expressions stay neutral. There is no tremor of remorse, no weight in their tone that matches the gravity of their words, and in that moment you realize you are not listening to regret, you are witnessing detachment. This emotional emptiness is unsettling because it breaks a fundamental human expectation. When people cause harm, we instinctively look for signs of discomfort in them, a pause, a lowered gaze, a struggle to speak. These small cues reassure us that the moral order still exists, that pain, once recognized, creates resistance inside the one who caused it. But when those signs are absent, the ground shifts. The confession feels clinical, almost procedural, as though your suffering were a fact on a page rather than a wound in a living soul. The mind recoils from this mismatch. How can something that nearly destroyed you be narrated with such calm? How can devastation be recalled without visible weight? This disconnect produces a quiet horror, not dramatic, but cold. It suggests that the person speaking has already separated themselves from the consequences of their actions. They are recounting events, not confronting them. And that separation is what terrifies the listener most. In that moment, you realize the pain was never shared. While you carried it inwardly, absorbing its shock and confusion, they carried nothing outwardly. Their emotional ledger appears balanced, while yours was left in deficit. This realization deepens the wound because it confirms that empathy was absent not only during the act, but even afterward. The harm was not just done, it was left unfelt. There is also an unsettling power dynamic in this emotional flatness. When someone speaks of your suffering without visible impact, it subtly positions them above it, as if they are immune to what affected you so deeply. This can feel humiliating, not because you were weak, but because your pain was treated as insignificant. Indifference communicates a message harsher than cruelty, that your suffering did not matter enough to disturb them. Such moments force a painful redefinition of who you thought they were. You may have believed them to be flawed, yet capable of remorse, broken yet redeemable through understanding. But emotional detachment strips away these narratives. It exposes a void where conscience should reside. And once you see that void, you cannot unsee it. The person before you becomes unfamiliar, even alien, not because they are different, but because they are unmoved. This absence of emotional response also casts doubt on the sincerity of the confession itself. If there is no visible struggle, no emotional cost, then the truth may not be offered as repentance but as release. They speak to rid themselves of burden, not to acknowledge yours. The confession becomes an act of self-cleansing rather than accountability, and that realization compounds the sense of violation. You may find yourself searching their face for something, anything, that suggests humanity beneath the calm. But when nothing appears, the search itself becomes exhausting. It is deeply disorienting to realize that the one who caused the damage is less affected by it than the one who endured it. This inversion of emotional weight feels unjust in a way words cannot fully capture. And so, what lingers is not the confession but the silence around it, the silence where empathy should have spoken, the silence where remorse should have lived. In that silence, understanding crystallizes. This was not merely a mistake followed by honesty. It was harm followed by indifference, and that knowledge changes how you see them forever, because it reveals not just what they did, but what they lack. Late honesty does not undo damage. It often reopens wounds that had barely begun to close. There is a cruel irony in the timing of such truth. By the time it arrives, you have already paid the price in silence. You endured confusion, self-doubt, restless nights, and unanswered questions. You carried the weight alone, learning how to function around the pain, slowly stitching yourself together with fragile coping and forced acceptance. Then, just as the bleeding seemed to slow, the confession arrives, and the wound tears open again. What makes late honesty so painful is that it does not meet you where the harm occurred. It meets you after survival has begun. You are no longer standing in the moment of betrayal. You are standing in its aftermath, trying to rebuild balance. The truth does not land on an open wound. It lands on scar tissue. And scar tissue, though healed, is sensitive. It remembers. When disturbed, it hurts differently than before, sharper and more disorienting, because it carries memory as well as pain. There is also a sense of injustice embedded in delayed truth. You were denied clarity when you needed it most. You were left to interpret silence, contradictions, and emotional distance without guidance. During that time, you blamed yourself. You questioned your perceptions. You wondered if you were imagining things, exaggerating, or being unfair. Late honesty reveals that all of that suffering was unnecessary, that the truth existed while you were drowning in uncertainty. This realization can feel like a second betrayal. The confession does not merely inform you, it rewrites your past. Moments you thought you understood suddenly change meaning. Conversations you replayed endlessly now carry a different weight. The mind returns to those memories, not to heal, but to reprocess them under a harsher light. This backward collapse is exhausting. It pulls you out of the present and drags you into a past you thought you had already faced. Healing stalls because the timeline itself has been disrupted. What deepens the pain is that late honesty often arrives without accountability equal to its impact. The speaker may expect closure, forgiveness, or even gratitude for finally telling the truth. But honesty delayed is not the same as honesty offered freely. It does not arrive as courage, it arrives as necessity. The truth comes out not because conscience demanded it, but because silence could no longer hold it. And that distinction matters. It changes the moral weight of the confession. Late truth also isolates. By the time it arrives, others may believe the issue has passed. You may have already minimized it outwardly, presenting strength because weakness felt unsafe. When the confession reopens the wound, there is no audience prepared to understand why it hurts again. You are expected to be past it. This expectation creates a lonely kind of suffering, one where grief feels illegitimate simply because it resurfaced late. There is something particularly cruel about being forced to grieve twice, once for the harm itself, and again for the clarity that arrives too late to change anything. The second grief is quieter but heavier. It carries resignation rather than shock. You are no longer asking, "Why did this happen?" but "Why was I denied the truth when it could have saved me?" That question has no satisfying answer, and its emptiness lingers. And yet, despite all this, late honesty still serves one undeniable purpose. It ends self-betrayal. It confirms that your pain was real, your instincts accurate, your reactions justified. While it does not heal the wound, it stops the bleeding caused by doubt. The damage remains, but the confusion surrounding it dissolves. You no longer have to wonder if you imagined the harm, you know. So while late honesty reopens wounds, it also closes the door on illusion. It hurts not because it is false, but because it is true. and because truth, when withheld too long, does not arrive as medicine. It arrives as a reminder of how long you survived without it. Confession destroys illusion and strips away every excuse you once made for them. Illusion is fragile, yet it can survive astonishing amounts of strain. It survives unanswered questions, contradictory behavior, and even quiet dread, because the mind prefers a comforting story to a painful truth. Before the confession, you were living inside that story. You told yourself they meant no harm, that circumstances were complicated, that intentions mattered more than outcomes. Each excuse felt reasonable on its own, and together they formed a shelter, thin but sufficient to keep hope alive. When the truth is finally spoken, that shelter collapses all at once, not gradually, not gently. One sentence can undo years of justification. The words do not argue with your excuses, they render them irrelevant. Suddenly, every explanation you crafted feels hollow, almost embarrassing in its generosity. You realize how much effort you invested in protecting someone else's image, even at the expense of your own clarity. The confession does not merely correct the record. It exposes how much emotional labor illusion demanded from you. What is unsettling is how natural those excuses once felt. You were not lying to yourself maliciously. You were trying to preserve meaning, continuity, and emotional safety. Illusion often masquerades as loyalty. It whispers that patience is virtue, that understanding is maturity, that doubt is a failure of compassion. Under its influence, you reinterpret harm as misunderstanding and distance as temporary confusion. The confession silences that voice. It replaces persuasion with fact, and fact is merciless to fantasy. As illusion dissolves, memory rearranges itself. Moments you once dismissed as insignificant rise with new gravity. That uneasy feeling you ignored, the pause that felt wrong, the inconsistency you brushed aside, they all align into a pattern that can no longer be denied. This alignment is painful, not because it surprises you, but because it confirms what you sensed but refused to articulate. The confession validates intuition at the exact moment it makes it impossible to return to comfort. There is also a peculiar grief in losing illusion. You are not only mourning what was done, you are mourning the version of the person you believed in. Illusion allowed you to love an idea of who they were, who they could be, who they claimed to be. When the truth strips that away, it leaves a vacancy where belief once lived. That emptiness aches because belief gave coherence to your past. Without it, you must reconstruct your story from more painful materials. Excuses fall apart one by one under the weight of truth. They didn't know dies first. Then, they didn't mean it. Soon after, they would never do this on purpose. Each excuse collapses not with drama, but with finality. There is no argument left to make. The confession does not invite debate. It closes the case. This closure is not comforting, it is clarifying, and clarity, while necessary, can feel brutal when it dismantles everything you worked to preserve. As illusion fades, responsibility shifts. You stop carrying explanations that were never yours to bear. You see how often you translated their behavior into kinder meanings, how often you softened edges that cut you. The confession returns ownership to its rightful place. What they did is no longer something you must reinterpret. It stands alone, unfiltered, and that separation between their actions and your explanations creates a strange relief alongside the pain. This relief is subtle but real. Illusion required maintenance. It demanded constant vigilance, constant reframing, constant hope. Truth, though harsh, demands nothing. It simply is. Once illusion is gone, your mind no longer needs to perform acrobatics to preserve peace. The exhaustion of pretending subsides, replaced by a steadier, quieter awareness. You are no longer negotiating with reality, you are facing it. Confession, then, is not just an admission, it is a reckoning with illusion itself. It forces you to see how far you stretched compassion to cover what should never have been justified. That realization hurts, but it also reclaims something essential, your right to clarity. And once illusion is stripped away, what remains is not cruelty or bitterness, but a grounded understanding that no excuse can survive the truth, and that you are no longer required to invent one. Truth removes self-doubt and proves that your intuition was not imagination or weakness. Before the confession, doubt lived quietly inside you, like a slow drip you learned to ignore. You questioned yourself in small, exhausting ways. You replayed conversations, analyzed tone, reconsidered expressions. You wondered whether you were being unfair, too sensitive, too suspicious. The absence of proof forced you into a private trial where you were both judge and accused. And more often than not, you ruled against yourself. Self-doubt is rarely loud. It does not shout accusations. It whispers suggestions. It tells you that love requires patience, that loyalty means endurance, that questioning is a failure of character. It persuades you that your discomfort is exaggeration and your instincts are unreliable. Over time, this quiet erosion does more damage than the original harm. You stop trusting your perceptions. You learn to override your inner alarms. You teach yourself to tolerate what feels wrong because certainty feels unreachable. When the truth finally arrives, it does something almost shocking in its simplicity. It ends the argument. There is no longer a debate between what you felt and what you were told to believe. The truth steps in and confirms that the unease was not imagined, that the tension in your chest was not paranoia, that the nights spent restless were not overreaction. The inner voice you silenced is suddenly vindicated, not because it was loud, but because it was accurate. This validation is powerful precisely because it comes after prolonged uncertainty. You were not wrong for doubting. You were wronged by being kept in the dark. The truth reframes your past suffering, not as emotional instability, but as a natural response to deception. You begin to see that intuition did not fail you. You were simply trained not to listen to it. That realization restores something essential: trust in your own mind. There is a deep relief in no longer having to question your sanity. Gaslighting, whether intentional or subtle, teaches people to distrust themselves. It makes reality feel slippery, unstable, negotiable. Truth anchors reality again. It places firm ground beneath your feet. You can finally say, without hesitation, "I was right to feel this way." That sentence alone can lift years of psychological weight. What is often misunderstood is that intuition is not mystical or dramatic. It is quiet pattern recognition. It notices inconsistencies before the mind is ready to name them. It senses emotional incongruence long before evidence appears. When truth confirms intuition, it reveals that your mind was processing reality accurately all along. The delay was not in understanding, it was in confirmation. And that distinction matters because it returns dignity to your inner experience. As self-doubt dissolves, clarity replaces it. You stop dissecting every memory in search of alternative explanations. You stop asking what you could have done differently to change the outcome. The truth makes it clear that the responsibility was never yours to manage. You were responding to incomplete information, not failing to interpret reality. That awareness softens self-blame and redirects it away from your character. This shift also strengthens future discernment. You begin to trust the early signals again, the discomfort, the hesitation, the quiet sense that something is off. You no longer dismiss them as weakness. You recognize them as intelligence. The truth trains you to respect your inner compass rather than override it for the sake of harmony. That respect becomes a form of self-protection, earned through pain but carried forward with wisdom. Perhaps the most healing part of truth is that it reunites you with yourself. Doubt divides the mind against itself. Intuition pulls it back together. When truth validates intuition, the inner conflict ends. You are no longer split between what you feel and what you allow yourself to believe. The parts of you that sense danger are no longer silenced or shamed. They are acknowledged. In this way, truth does more than expose wrongdoing. It repairs the damaged doubt inflicted on your sense of self. It teaches you that awareness is not cruelty and suspicion is not bitterness. It confirms that your inner voice did not betray you, it waited. And now that it has been proven right, you are finally free to listen to it without apology. Realizing the harm was intentional forces a painful but necessary moral reckoning. This is the moment when the mind can no longer soften reality with comforting explanations. Intention changes the moral landscape entirely. It removes the possibility that this was merely unfortunate, misunderstood, or accidental. You are no longer dealing with chaos or error. You are dealing with choice, and choice demands judgment, not the loud, vengeful kind, but the quiet, internal kind that rearranges how you see right and wrong, trust and danger, closeness and distance. At first, the mind resists this reckoning. It feels too heavy, too final. You may find yourself wanting to retreat into earlier narratives because those narratives allowed room for hope. Intention shuts that room. It introduces a stark question you cannot avoid. What does it mean that someone knew and proceeded anyway? This question is uncomfortable because it forces you to stop focusing on the act alone and start examining the character behind it. And character, once revealed, is harder to excuse than behavior. This reckoning also exposes how much moral energy you invested in protecting them. You were not neutral. You leaned toward mercy. You interpreted ambiguity in their favor. You gave the benefit of the doubt repeatedly, often at your own expense. When intention is revealed, you realize that your kindness was operating in a one-sided moral economy. You were extending grace to someone who was exercising choice without restraint. That realization hurts, but it is clarifying. It shows you where your standards were higher and where they were absent. There is also a reckoning with your own boundaries. You must confront how much you tolerated before clarity arrived. This is not an exercise in self-blame, but in self-awareness. You begin to see how loyalty, patience, or fear of conflict may have delayed your recognition of reality. Intention forces you to ask hard questions. What do I allow? What do I excuse? Where do I draw the line when harm is deliberate? These questions are uncomfortable because they require growth, not just grief. Moral reckoning reshapes memory as well. You stop remembering events as isolated incidents and begin to see them as expressions of will. Patterns emerge. Repetition becomes visible. What once seemed like unfortunate coincidence now looks like consistent disregard. This shift is sobering. It removes the emotional fog and replaces it with moral clarity. And while clarity can feel cruel at first, it is also stabilizing. It tells you that what happened fits together, not because it was justified, but because it was chosen. There is a particular weight in realizing that intention means alternatives existed. They could have stopped, they could have spoken, they could have chosen differently. This knowledge is painful because it eliminates fate as a scapegoat. Nothing just happened. Someone decided, and when you fully accept that, you stop negotiating with what cannot be undone. You stop asking how to fix the past and start asking how to protect the future. This reckoning also marks the end of false equivalence. You no longer feel compelled to balance blame evenly or search for your share of responsibility in something you did not choose. Intention clarifies moral ownership. It returns accountability to its rightful place. That shift is not about punishment, it is about truth. It frees you from carrying weight that was never yours. As difficult as this reckoning is, it produces a quieter strength. You become less easily confused by charm, apology, or partial truth. You understand that morality is not proven by words spoken after the fact, but by restraint exercised before harm occurs. This understanding sharpens your discernment. It teaches you to respect actions over explanations, patterns over promises. In the end, recognizing intention does not harden you, it grounds you. It replaces emotional confusion with ethical clarity. You may grieve what was lost, but you no longer misunderstand why it was lost. The reckoning hurts because it asks you to grow beyond illusion, but once it has done its work, it leaves you steadier, clearer, and far less willing to betray your own sense of right and wrong again. Such revelations expose how easily trust can be weaponized against a good heart. Trust, in its pure form, is not naive, it is generous. It is the willingness to believe that another person will handle your vulnerability with care. You offer it not because you are foolish, but because you are whole enough to assume goodness until proven otherwise. And that is precisely what makes its misuse so disturbing. When trust is turned into a tool for harm, it reveals not weakness in the one who trusted, but opportunism in the one who received it. What becomes clear after the confession is how much access trust provided. You opened doors that caution would have kept closed. You shared thoughts, fears, histories, pieces of yourself that were never meant to be exposed to someone careless. Trust allowed them proximity, and proximity gave them leverage. This is not something you recognize in the moment. It is something you understand afterward, when you see how information was used, how silence was timed, how reassurance was given only to delay accountability. The most unsettling realization is that your goodness became predictable. You were consistent, you were forgiving, you were inclined to understand rather than accuse. These traits, which should have been met with respect, were instead studied. They learned how far they could go because you showed them how much you were willing to endure. This does not mean you invited harm. It means someone observed your kindness and decided it could be exploited. There is a quiet violation in realizing that your trust was not simply broken, but manipulated. You were not just hurt, you were managed. Conversations were shaped to keep you calm. Partial truths were released to control perception. Apologies were used as pauses rather than change. Trust became the very mechanism that kept you close while damage continued. This realization stings because it reveals intention not only in the act, but in the strategy. This understanding can deeply affect how you see yourself. You may feel embarrassed for trusting, as though openness itself were a flaw, but this is a dangerous conclusion. Trust did not fail you, it was betrayed. There is a critical difference. To confuse the two is to punish your own integrity for someone else's misuse of it. A good heart is not a liability. It is only vulnerable in the presence of those who lack restraint. What hurts most is recognizing how invisible the weaponization was while it was happening. Trust does not announce its misuse, it erodes quietly. You notice small discomforts, unexplained tensions, moments that don't quite align, but because trust exists, you explain them away. You assume shared values, you assume decency. That assumption becomes the camouflage that allows harm to continue unnoticed. Only afterward does the full shape of manipulation come into view. This revelation also clarifies something essential. Discernment must grow alongside trust, not to eliminate it, but to protect it. A good heart does not need to close, it needs boundaries. Trust should be offered gradually, not all at once. It should be responsive to behavior, not sustained by hope alone. Understanding this does not make you colder, it makes you wiser. It teaches you that trust is not proven by words, but by consistency over time. As painful as it is, seeing how trust was weaponized reshapes your future relationships in a necessary way. You become more attentive to how people handle small power before giving them greater access. You notice whether vulnerability is met with care or curiosity. You stop mistaking intensity for intimacy, apology for accountability, familiarity for safety. These lessons are costly, but they are protective. Perhaps the hardest part is accepting that a good heart will always carry some risk. There is no version of openness that comes with guarantees, but the answer is not to harden. It is to honor your goodness enough to guard it. Trust should be shared, not surrendered. It should be earned, not assumed. When you learn this, the pain begins to transform, not into bitterness, but into discernment. In this way, the revelation does more than expose betrayal. It teaches you the difference between kindness and access. It shows you that while trust can be weaponized, it can also be reclaimed, this time with clarity, boundaries, and the quiet confidence that your goodness was never the mistake. The disgust you feel is not bitterness, it is your moral compass asserting itself. Bitterness corrodes from the inside. It seeks to punish, to replay, to poison the present with the past. Disgust, by contrast, is clarifying. It rises not to harm but to warn. It is the soul's instinctive recoil from something that violates its deepest understanding of right and wrong. When you feel it, you are not becoming cruel, you are becoming conscious. For a long time, you may have tried to suppress this feeling. You told yourself to be mature, forgiving, understanding. You worried that reacting strongly meant you were holding on to resentment, but disgust is not the same as hatred. Hatred wants engagement, disgust wants distance. Hatred fixates, disgust draws a boundary. One binds you to the offender, the other frees you from them. What you are experiencing is not emotional immaturity, it is ethical clarity. Moral instincts often speak through discomfort before they speak through language. The body tightens, the mind recoils. Something inside you says, "This is not acceptable." That reaction is ancient and necessary. It exists to protect you from normalizing what should never be normalized. When someone crosses a line knowingly and you feel disgust, that feeling is not a failure of compassion. It is compassion for yourself finally finding a voice. There is a cultural tendency to pathologize this response. People are encouraged to let go, move on, or be the bigger person, often before their inner compass has finished recalibrating. But rushing past disgust can be dangerous. It can push you back into self-betrayal, into minimizing harm, into reopening doors that should remain closed. Disgust is not asking you to dwell, it is asking you to remember. It is saying, "Do not forget what this cost you." This moral response also restores balance where manipulation created confusion. When you were being deceived, your instincts were dulled by doubt. You questioned whether your reactions were justified. You wondered if you were overreacting. Disgust arrives after truth and says, with quiet authority, "Your reaction fits the reality." It aligns feeling with fact. That alignment is stabilizing. It brings your inner world back into order. What is important to understand is that disgust does not demand revenge. It does not require confrontation. It does not even require explanation. It simply insists on truth. It insists that certain behaviors disqualify people from closeness. That insistence is not cruelty, it is discernment. A moral compass does not shout, it points. And where it points now is away from what violated it. You may notice that as this feeling settles, your need to explain yourself diminishes. You stop rehearsing arguments in your head. You stop trying to justify your boundaries to imaginary audiences. Disgust simplifies. It reduces complexity. It says, "This is enough information." In that simplicity, peace begins, not because the past is erased, but because the present is no longer negotiating with it. This response also protects your future self. It becomes a reference point. When similar behaviors appear later in different forms, your body remembers. Your compass recognizes the pattern before your mind does. Disgust, then, becomes wisdom stored in the nervous system. It teaches without lecturing. It guards without aggression. It is quiet, but it is firm. Perhaps the most important shift is this. You stop seeing disgust as something shameful. You stop labeling it as negativity. You recognize it as self-respect waking up. It is the moment when your values reassert themselves after being tested. It is the internal declaration that some things are beneath you, not because you are superior, but because you are aligned with something higher than convenience or tolerance. In this way, disgust becomes a form of healing. It closes the chapter without drama. It does not seek closure from the one who caused harm. It creates closure within you. It marks the line between what you will endure and what you will not. And once that line is drawn, you no longer need to argue with yourself. Your moral compass has spoken, and you are finally listening. Silence, distance, and firm boundaries become acts of self-respect rather than punishment. This is one of the hardest truths to accept, because for a long time you were taught that withdrawing is cruel, that distance is a form of rejection, that boundaries are weapons. But after truth has been spoken and harm has been exposed, you begin to see these actions differently. They are not retaliations, they are refusals. Refusals to continue participating in what corrodes your dignity. Silence, in this context, is not avoidance. It is discernment. It is the decision to stop offering your voice to someone who has already proven they will not treat it with care. You are no longer trying to be understood by someone who chose not to understand you when it mattered. Silence is not empty. It is full of recognition. It says, without drama or explanation, you no longer have access to my inner world. That is not punishment, that is protection. Distance works the same way. You are not creating space to make them feel your absence. You are creating space so you can finally feel yourself again. Proximity to someone who violated trust keeps the nervous system on alert. Even neutral interactions carry tension, unspoken reminders, unresolved weight. Distance allows the body to exhale. It allows your thoughts to slow down instead of constantly bracing for impact. Stepping back is not abandonment, it is recovery. Boundaries, perhaps more than anything else, are misunderstood. They are often framed as cold or unforgiving, but in reality, boundaries are deeply ethical. They are how you align behavior with values. When someone crosses a line knowingly, the boundary that follows is not an emotional reaction, it is a logical consequence. Boundaries are not walls built in anger, they are lines drawn in clarity. They define where respect ends and self-betrayal begins. What makes this shift difficult is guilt. You may feel guilty for not explaining yourself further, for not giving another chance, for not offering closure. But closure is not something you owe to someone who already had the truth and misused it. Closure is something you create by choosing not to reopen what harmed you. Silence, distance, and boundaries are not the absence of compassion. They are compassion redirected inward. There is also fear in choosing this path. Fear of being misunderstood. Fear of being labeled harsh, unforgiving, or dramatic. But growth often requires the courage to be misinterpreted. You are no longer responsible for maintaining a version of yourself that makes others comfortable at the expense of your well-being. Boundaries will always disappoint those who benefited from your lack of them. As these choices settle, something subtle but powerful happens. You stop explaining your pain. You stop reliving the story. You stop waiting for acknowledgement that may never come. Your energy returns to you. Conversations become quieter. Decisions become simpler. You are no longer managing emotional chaos that does not belong to you. Peace enters not as joy, but as absence. Absence of tension, absence of self-doubt, absence of justification. It is important to understand that silence does not mean you have nothing to say. It means you have learned when speaking costs more than it gives. Distance does not mean you lack care. It means you have learned that closeness without safety is not connection. Boundaries do not mean you have hardened. They mean you have defined yourself. These acts also reshape how you move forward. You begin to recognize earlier when something feels off. You no longer push past discomfort to preserve harmony. You allow yourself to step back without needing a dramatic reason. This is not avoidance. It is maturity. It is the wisdom that comes from understanding what certain access costs you. Perhaps the most liberating realization is this. You do not need their understanding to validate your boundaries. You do not need agreement to enforce self-respect. Boundaries are not negotiations. They are declarations of worth. And once declared, they do not need to be defended endlessly. They simply need to be honored by you. In choosing silence, distance, and firm boundaries, you are not closing yourself off from life. You are choosing the conditions under which your life will continue. You are saying quietly but firmly that your peace is not a bargaining chip and your dignity is not available for negotiation. Accepting the truth, however revolting, becomes the moment you begin reclaiming your dignity and clarity. This acceptance is not dramatic. It does not arrive with relief or triumph. It comes quietly, often when resistance finally exhausts itself. You stop arguing with what happened. You stop trying to soften it, reframe it, or make it more bearable than it truly was. You let it stand as it is, ugly, unsettling, and undeniable, and in doing so you take the first real step back toward yourself. For a long time, dignity was compromised not by the act alone, but by the confusion that followed it. You were forced into explanations, negotiations, emotional contortions that slowly pulled you away from your own center. You questioned your reactions. You doubted your standards. You adjusted your expectations downward just to keep the peace. Acceptance ends that erosion. It restores the simple truth that what violated you was wrong and that no amount of context or complexity can change that. Clarity follows acceptance in an unexpected way. It does not flood the mind with answers. It clears the fog that once obscured them. You begin to see your past reactions with gentler eyes. You understand why you stayed silent, why you hoped, why you hesitated to judge. Those responses no longer look like weakness, they look like survival. And with that understanding, shame loosens its grip. You stop punishing yourself for what you endured without full information. There is a profound shift when you stop asking the truth to feel better. Acceptance does not demand comfort, it demands honesty. You allow yourself to feel disgust without guilt, sadness without apology, distance without justification. These emotions no longer compete with one another, they align. The inner conflict that once drained you between knowing and denying, sensing and doubting, begins to resolve. You are no longer split. You are whole again, even if still wounded. Reclaiming dignity does not mean becoming untouchable. It means becoming anchored. You stop outsourcing your sense of worth to explanations, apologies, or recognition from the one who caused harm. You realize that dignity was never something they could grant or take away. It was something you temporarily set aside to survive confusion. Acceptance brings it back into your possession, quietly, permanently. This clarity also reshapes how you move forward. You no longer chase closure from the source of pain. You understand that some truths are not meant to be discussed endlessly. They are meant to be acknowledged and then respected through action. You begin to trust your decisions without needing to rehearse them mentally. The urge to explain fades. The need to convince disappears. What remains is a steady inner agreement. This is enough information. There is strength in no longer needing the story to end differently. Acceptance frees you from revising the past in hopes of emotional relief. You stop imagining alternate versions where things were said sooner or handled better. You accept that this is how clarity arrived, and that its timing, however cruel, still served one essential purpose. It returned you to yourself. Perhaps the most meaningful change is this. You stop measuring your healing by how little you feel and start measuring it by how honestly you live. You no longer suppress reactions to appear healed. You honor what your inner world communicates. That honesty becomes a form of integrity, and integrity becomes the foundation for everything that follows. In accepting the truth, you do not excuse it. You do not make peace with it. You simply stop denying its space in your understanding, and in that refusal to look away, something stabilizing takes hold. You are no longer confused about who you are, what you value, or what you will tolerate. The truth may have arrived as something revolting, but acceptance transforms it into the moment where clarity returns, dignity is reclaimed, and your inner life finally stands on solid ground again. What remains after everything has been spoken, exposed, and understood is not rage, not revenge, not even sadness in its rawest form, but a quiet finality. You are no longer wrestling with what happened or who they truly were. The truth has done its work. It has stripped away illusion, silenced doubt, clarified intention, and revealed character without disguise. And in that revelation, something decisive settles within you. You no longer need answers. You no longer need explanations. You no longer need them. The confession that once felt disgusting no longer holds power over you, because its purpose has been fulfilled. It showed you what you needed to see. It confirmed what your instincts already knew. It ended the internal war between hope and reality. What once shocked you now steadies you. What once revolted you now instructs you. The truth did not come to destroy you. It came to free you from confusion. You walk away not because you are hardened, but because you are clear. You leave not in bitterness, but in self-respect. You carry forward discernment instead of doubt, boundaries instead of guilt, dignity instead of explanation. The story does not end with forgiveness demanded or reconciliation forced. It ends with alignment between your values, your instincts, and your actions, and perhaps that is the quiet victory hidden inside the ugliness of truth. It returns you to yourself, unconfused, unashamed, awake.